Hello and welcome back to Tutoring with Gavin. In this series of video tutorials, I'll be teaching you how to write a grade 9 essay for each of the GCSE Literature exam questions. In this video tutorial, I'll be taking you through the process of writing an essay for the following AQA question. How and why does Scrooge change in A Christmas Carol? Write about how Scrooge responds to other characters or spirits in the story and how Dickens presents Scrooge by the way he writes. The first thing I would do if faced with this question is highlight the keywords so that I'm absolutely sure I understand what I'm being asked to do. In this case, it's clear that the focus is on the character of Scrooge, mapping out his character arc which shows his rapid change. To show how Scrooge changes, I need quotations from the novel, from key moments of his development as a character. To understand why he changes, I will need to explore the effects other characters have on him. The third strand of the question is to show how the writer Charles Dickens presents Scrooge. I would start by jotting down some prompts that I need to cover in the essay, which is purely guided by the mark scheme, which is the best way to understand what the exam board are looking for. In each paragraph I will check the list because this is how I'm rewarded with the mark. The prompts would include form and structure, genre, character function, context, literary devices, effect on the reader, quotations or evidence, terminology, setting, themes, Dickens' ideas or purpose, my own personal response, and a reminder to proofread for the spelling, punctuation and grammar. Next, I plot out the character arc of Scrooge with key events or moments that show his change, and I would synthesize these ideas into a sequenced plan. So the plan would include what the narrator says about him, or the tone, response to the family and those around him, response to Marley, response to the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future, and a contrast between the beginning and end of the novel. And then I'd finish on the conclusion and my personal response. In A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, a ghost story in the tradition of Christmas storytelling in Victorian England, we are presented with a memorable character in Ebenezer Scrooge, described early in the novella by the narrator as a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. The language Dickens uses here is harsh, designed to make the reader immediately recoil from this character, and yet within about 100 pages we are given a dramatic character arc, with Scrooge changing before our eyes, rapidly and miraculously. The 5 staves are like verses from an old folk song, unravelling a dramatic moment when someone turns from monster to human. It is a cautionary tale by a writer concerned with injustices against the poor during his lifetime, and he uses Scrooge to symbolise a cruel society that needed to change. What I've done here is I've focused on the task and introduced the context and awareness of the genre, but I'm also using quotations from the opening stave that are important when trying to map Scrooge's character arc. I've also commented on the narrative structure, as it's important when understanding Scrooge's change. Dickens wrote the story in 1843, using his own miserable experience as a child to show how poverty could have a devastating effect on health and welfare. The description of Scrooge before Marley's visit reflects a Malthusian attitude towards the poor and is apparent in what he says to those seeking charity who try to explain how terrible the workhouses are. If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Dickens cleverly uses wintry imagery to show this lack of humanity in Scrooge. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, a frosty rime was on his head, and he carried his own low temperature. The imagery is deliberate. It's hyperbolic in order to ensure the reader's repulsion of this character and everything he stands for. Negative adjectives like nipped and shriveled are symbolic of his cruelty and lack of humanity. The verbs Dickens uses for Scrooge are equally aggressive. When his nephew tries to show kindness and generosity of spirit towards Scrooge, he is growled at, repeating good afternoon to dismiss his nephew who only wants friendship. This paragraph contains some more context, but starts to delve into the imagery and literary devices used to create this powerful initial impression of Scrooge on the reader. The visit of Marley's ghost at the end of stave 1 signifies a warning of what awaits Scrooge after death because of his past sins. Marley has endured 7 years in purgatory and has finally begged for forgiveness, an important theme in the story. Part of his penance seems to be to instigate the change in his old partner. The imagery used by Dickens paints a bleak picture for those who have been cruel and greedy in life, doomed to wander through the world. For all the freedom that money has given Scrooge in life, he is now facing a similar fate, to wear the chains forged in life. Chains have connotations of punishment and prison. something Scrooge believed the poor deserved if they could not pay their debts. Dickens' own father had been imprisoned for this, with devastating effect on his wife and children. Dickens wants to drive home the message, both to Scrooge and the Victorian reader, that there will be no rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. The language has connotations of a religious sermon and reminds us of the saying, "No rest for the wicked," which would have been familiar to his readers. Dickens was a campaigner for a fairer society, and by presenting these deeply flawed partners, he could highlight the wickedness of Victorian England. Structurally, this is a pivotal moment in the story, because as readers, we now want to see if Scrooge can change for the better. I've tried to link the imagery here with the context, but I'm also linking it to the theme of forgiveness, poverty, and social injustice. I've also mentioned the narrative structure again, so that it's clear to the examiner that I'm responding to the question while covering all of the mark scheme criteria. When Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas past in Stave 2, the image of the spirit is difficult to define, much like a dream or distant memory. It tells Scrooge it is there for his reclamation. Reclamation is the act of returning something to a former, better state. The spirits seem intent on restoring Scrooge to a time when he was full of humanity and kindness. He is taken back to a childhood setting with 1,000 odours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. As with many smells, tastes or sounds, we can quickly find ourselves back in time. Dickens uses comforting imagery, such as floating, to contrast with the earlier imagery of hard, sharp and cold, used to describe the old Scrooge. Dickens is showing us through imagery that Scrooge was once a good child. For the reader, this creates more intrigue as to why Scrooge changed so much, and also foreshadows, using the power of 3 in hopes and joys and cares, the idea that his reclamation could succeed. He also uses a long list of questions to involve the reader in the transformation of Scrooge, when he asks, why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up? Scrooge sobbed to see himself neglected and wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be. Along with this emotive language, we're also given glimpses of his past that fill him with guilt for the way he has treated his nephew and Bob Cratchit. We know that Dickens' early childhood was idyllic, ruined by an unjust law. Throughout the story, Dickens presents us with clues as to why Scrooge becomes bitter, greedy and mean in his old age. Near the end of the stave, he's shown the moment when he lost out on true love with Belle, when she says, "Another idol has displaced me." And we see exactly what he has missed out on, a family of his own, something Dickens himself valued greatly. Dickens seemed to be saying that if you put greed before family, you will lose your soul and be forever miserable. I've tried to focus on the imagery again, linking it to the context, but showing how Dickens uses contrasting imagery and a variety of literary and structural devices to affect the reader's acceptance of the dramatic change that happens to Scrooge in a short space of time. The theme of guilt is also touched on here, while trying to build up an idea of what Dickens was trying to achieve with this story. In Stave 3, Scrooge is shown the joys of Christmas present and how it can lift the spirits once a year. Dickens was keen to help entrench Christmas festivities as a national tradition. Scrooge has locked himself away from this and has grown more bitter and lonely. The long descriptions of the food is enough to make the mouth water, unless you're a vegetarian. To form a kind of throne where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, the list goes on forever, a technique Dickens often used in his novels. Later in the chapter, when they visit the modest home of the Cratchits, we are given a contrasting image of a family making the best out of Christmas despite their poverty. Dickens uses uplifting words to describe the family, such as brave, goodly, rejoiced, gallantly, danced, exalted and proud. Dickens is showing his readers that you don't have to be rich to have fun at Christmas. Cratchit family have such a unity of spirit that Scrooge is left overcome with penitence and grief at the idea that Tiny Tim is very likely to die because of this poverty. This image of suffering is driven home at the end of the chapter with the revealing of ignorance and want, visual reminders of the effects of poverty. Throughout this chapter, the ghost repeats the words that Scrooge had uttered in Stave 1, like, "Are there no prisons?" Dickens cleverly shows the reader it is easy to say mean things when you are not affected by them, but if you are forced to experience empathy for these injustices, it will reduce ignorance and want. So in this paragraph, I've focused on the theme of Christmas and the purpose of the story. Again, the contrasting images are important in Dickens' writing as they force the reader to think. I've shown the next step in Scrooge's reclamation that sets the last paragraph up for the final stages in his transformation. Scrooge admits in Stave 4 to the ghost of the future, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen." This could be because he is suddenly aware that his behaviour has consequences and seems to dread what will happen next. He first witnesses businessmen laughing at the news of his death, which symbolises how he has worshipped false idols all of his life, for they care nothing of him in death. He then discovers that no one is sad that he has died because those in debt to him can avoid repayment. He dies alone, lying gasping out his last there, alone by himself, with nothing to show for a life dedicated to making money. While Tiny Tim's death is poignant for the reader, there is little reaction from Scrooge. He is devastated by his own death, focused on trying to change before it's too late. "I'm not the man I was," he says. "I yet may change these shadows." Dickens uses the image of shadows to represent the dark side of Scrooge's personality. This is the climactic moment in the story, when Scrooge is faced with the reality of how he will be judged upon his death, and the reader is left anticipating how this sad story will play out. In this paragraph, I've tried to step back a little and look at the symbolism of Stave 4 and what it teaches Scrooge about his behaviour. I've mentioned the narrative structure and how this affects the reader. The value of time is an important theme, and Scrooge shows in Stave 5 that he must make up for lost time. He does this with enthusiasm and energy, in complete contrast to Stave 1. The heavy, hard and cold imagery is now replaced with 4 similes, one after the other for effect. "I am light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man." These are positive images that lift the spirits. He cannot stop laughing, a long, long line of brilliant laughs. Again, this is contrasted with his miserable personality at the start of the story. Even the weather has cheered up. No fog, no mist, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air. This hyperbolic language supports the transformation in character through the techniques of pathetic fallacy. He makes amends with those he has wronged and seems genuinely changed. The mood of the novella ends with extreme joy, having begun so bitterly. Through the character of Scrooge, Dickens shows us in this short novel just how we should live, and does it using extreme contrast in mood, tone, imagery and characterization. It's not meant to be realistic. It is, however, uplifting and captures the spirit of Christmas perfectly. I've explored imagery and literary devices and tried to answer the question concisely. I've tried to sum up how I feel about the story, showing a personal response that also understands and addresses some of the criticisms sometimes thrown at it. Don't forget to proofread. Firstly, read the essay backwards, isolating each word to check for spelling. Then read the essay aloud in your head, listening for any grammar mistakes. Here is a grade 9 description in the mark scheme. So to check whether I have achieved this top level, which will give me a grade 9, you should ask these questions. Is this essay critical? This is critical because it closely analyses the text and forms a judgment at the end based on evidence I present. Is it exploratory? It is exploratory because it addresses the task in a focused way and tries to look at Scrooge's change from a fresh perspective that takes into account the writer's purpose. Is it a well-structured argument? Yes, because it was properly planned, with each point covered in a seamless sequence. Does it take a conceptualized approach to the full task? Yes, because the conclusions provided of why he changes are complex and carefully considered. Is it supported by a range of judicious references? Yes, as I used quotes from the novella as a whole that help demonstrate Scrooge's change and show how the writer achieves this. Is there a fine-grained and insightful analysis of language and form and structure? Yes, because by zooming in on the imagery and the literary devices, it enables analysis on how the writer shows Scrooge's change, and by considering the key structural moments in his character arc. Is there a judicious use of subject terminology? Yes, I've used terms like character arc, themes, symbolism, connotations, narrative structure, contrast, etc. Is there a convincing exploration of one or more ideas, perspectives, contextual factors and interpretations? Yes, by exploring the themes and context of poverty, injustice, forgiveness, Christmas tradition, time and greed at the time the story is set. As with any essay, there are many choices you have to make, but ultimately you must answer the question in an imaginative way, showing that you understand that the text is a creation by a writer who also had to make creative choices. If you show that understanding, then you'll be always rewarded for it by the examiner. Well, I hope this has helped you in your preparation for the exam. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to the channel so I can continue to make these free tutorials. Until next time.